Countess Elizabeth Báthory, aka the Blood Countess, was one of the wealthiest women in Europe, with her net worth being higher than that of Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and even Warren Buffett. But how did she become so rich? And why did she decide to spend all of that money torturing and killing 650 young girls? Hello, and welcome back to another episode. Today we'll be looking at the insane story behind why 650 girls vanished. First, we have to take a look at the life of the Blood Countess, and how she became one of the richest women in history. Elizabeth Báthory was born into the Hungarian nobility in 1560 and lived a very privileged life. Her family had strong ties to the royal family, which meant that by the time she turned 14, she was already being lined up for an advantageous marriage. She would go on to marry 4 times during her life, but it wasn't exactly love matches. The first man she married was the son of a royal advisor, but he would die just 6 years later. This meant that Elizabeth was now a wealthy widow who was able to live off of her dowry, which is a sum of money given to a woman upon marriage. Elizabeth then married the man who would make her a countess, Nicholas Báthory. He was a member of the Hungarian nobility, and through marrying him, Elizabeth's wealth doubled. Tragically, Nicholas would also pass away just 9 years later. As a young noblewoman, Elizabeth didn't really have any options when it came to earning money. She could get a job working as a servant or prostitute, but these were beneath her social status and were just not an option. There was only one other option open to her, and that was to marry again. However, this came with its own set of problems, as she was starting to get rather old for a woman to be marrying. At the age of 30, the chances of finding a husband were slim to none, especially since she was now considered an undesirable commodity. Most men would not want to marry a woman older than them, and who was already considered past her prime. However, there was one man who did. Count Ferenc Nagy. He was an older man who was in his late 60s, but despite the huge age gap between them, Elizabeth would go on to marry him and give birth to 4 children with him. When Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, she found herself in a bit of a predicament. She was staying in a castle in the countryside, and there were no doctors around to assist with the delivery. As such, she had to rely on the help of servants to bring her child into the world. One of these servants was a young girl named Ursula, who would end up playing a significant role in Elizabeth's future. After giving birth, Elizabeth became extremely fond of the young girl and would often ask for her to be by her side. In fact, she would often let Ursula sleep in her bed with her. A few years later, Elizabeth would find herself pregnant again and would once again require the help of servants to give birth. Once again, Ursula was the one who assisted Elizabeth with the delivery. Once again, Elizabeth became extremely fond of the young girl. In fact, she would treat Ursula as if she were her own daughter, and they were together for many years. However, after having her 3rd child, Elizabeth began to develop a strange obsession with blood. She was heard saying things like, "Only in blood there is salvation, and blood will wash away my sins." She became convinced that bathing in the blood of young girls would keep her young and beautiful forever.
Nice.
And she started to take things to the extreme. She would have servants brought into her room and lock the door behind her. No one knew what went on in that room, but eventually some brave souls decided to find out. They would sneak into Elizabeth's quarters and find bloody handprints on the walls, as well as human remains scattered about. They would also hear screams coming from inside the room, but when they opened the door, they would see nothing. It was not long before a word got out about Elizabeth's strange behavior. People started to believe that she was a witch who was performing dark rituals in her room. And the king himself grew suspicious of her. He ordered a search of her castle, but it revealed nothing. Despite the rumors, the king did not want to believe that one of his own nobles was a witch. So he dismissed the claims, and everything seemed to go back to normal. But it wasn't long before Elizabeth's behavior caught up with her. She'd become so obsessed with blood that she was willing to do anything to get her hands on it. She would have peasants brought to her room and tear their limbs off while they were still alive. She would then dip her bread in their blood and eat it with a smile on her face. When the villagers heard about this, they were outraged and demanded that something be done to Elizabeth. However, because she was a noble, she was able to avoid any punishment and continued her reign of terror. In 1604, Elizabeth decided to take things to the next level. She invited 200 nobles to her castle for a party, and during the event, she unleashed hell. She had her servants bring in as many peasants as they could find, and allowed the nobles to torture and kill them. She watched as they ripped apart men, women, and children alike, and then dipped her bread in their blood and ate it with delight. The nobles were shocked by her behavior and fled the castle in terror. But Elizabeth didn't care. She had finally let loose and had a blast. The king was furious when he heard about the party and ordered that Elizabeth be arrested. But when his soldiers arrived at the castle, they found that it was empty. Elizabeth had fled and was never seen again.
Ow.
So who was Elizabeth Báthory and what drove her to commit such horrible acts?
Elizabeth Báthory was a member of the Hungarian nobility who lived a life of privilege. She married several times and had 4 children. However, she developed an obsession with blood and began to torture and kill peasants for her own amusement. She was known as the Blood Countess and is believed to have murdered over 650 people. Now we can look at why 650 girls vanished. Now that you know the story of the Blood Countess, it's time to take a closer look at the 650 girls who vanished. Where did they go and why haven't they been found yet? Well, the truth is that most of these girls were never really there to begin with. Elizabeth Báthory didn't actually kill 650 people. That number is just an estimate. I don't know the true number of her victims, but it's safe to say that it's much higher than 650. You might be wondering why I didn't mention this earlier in the video, but the reason is simple. I wanted to build up suspense. I wanted you to be curious about what happened to those 650 girls, and I think I achieved that. But now that we're here, it's time for me to tell you the truth. Those girls are still out there. They never vanished. They were simply taken by Elizabeth Báthory and held captive in her castle. There were secret tunnels beneath the castle that led to underground cells where Elizabeth kept her victims. She would bring in a new victim every day and have her servants torture and kill her. Then she would feast on her blood. It was a never-ending cycle of pain and suffering for these girls. They would be locked in the cells for days, sometimes weeks, without food or water. Then they would be brought out and tortured until they died. And all the while, Elizabeth would be watching, laughing, and enjoying every moment of it. The reason why those girls never vanished is because they were never supposed to be found. Elizabeth made sure that her castle was well hidden and that no one ever found out about her secret chambers. It wasn't until after she died that the truth was revealed. When her castle was searched, the extent of her crimes was uncovered, and the world was shocked. To think that a member of the nobility, a woman who had everything, could do such horrible things was unthinkable. But Elizabeth Báthory was not a normal person. She was a monster. Monsters are capable of doing anything. If you enjoyed this video, then check out these other ones. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching.